Hello, everyone. Really excited to be having this conversation today. It's an absolute honor and privilege to be moderating this conversation with three of my personal role models and focusing on diversity and management from an LGBT plus perspective. We have the powerhouses that are Jim Fitterling, Chairman and CEO of Dow, Beth Ford, President and CEO of Land O'Lakes, and Inga Beale, Chair of Mediclinic. So I'm going to launch straight into the question because we've only got 30 minutes. So let's get straight into it and let's have this conversation. I wanted to start by talking about, when we talk about representation, we need to know the data. Like, where do we start? Like, how do we know how LGBTQ the C-suite and the boardrooms are of today if we've not collected that data? So I was really keen to get your perspective on how do you think we collect that data in the boardroom and the C-suite? Have you seen it work anywhere else? Because what I found is that with chairmen and CEOs, there is sometimes nervousness and discomfort around collecting this data for this demographic. So how do we even ease that discomfort? So I'd love to come to you first, Beth.
Well, I mean, what you're pushing on there is self-identification, right? And somebody's comfort. And I'm not sure that in and of itself, for me, is primary. I mean, journey at a different point in time, and we need to be supportive of that. I think we can ask the question, and just the fact that we're asking the question is a step forward. I reflect on this and think to myself that I'm sure when I show up in a meeting, I'm showing up as the CEO. I'm not showing up as the female CEO or the gay CEO. I'm showing up as the CEO of the company. And then other parts of my life are known. What I reflect on in terms of gathering information over time to understand where we're sitting is I compare it to my daughter, who is a college sophomore. And these are standard questions now being asked in colleges, and there's a lot of comfort in conveying that information versus in a company where I think it's a step forward that just the question is being asked. And I also believe that most of the change that occurs in an organization, yes, it comes from the top, but really throughout the organization, how are they thinking about their representation, their voice, their visibility? And I think that to me is more important than necessarily us identifying how many CEOs, how many board members, et cetera, are identifying as LGBTQ.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Beth, in the fact that there is research recently that showed Gen Z or Gen Z, over half of them identified as anything other than straight or heterosexual. So this next generation is really pushing the boundaries of gender identity and sexual orientation in comparison to our generation. So Jim, any thoughts from you in terms of this data collection and figuring out, well, how LGBTQ is the C-suite and boardroom?
Yeah, I think there are different ways to track it. I mean, for the last I'd say several years, we've been using our employee surveys at the end of every year, where we get a pulse on engagement in the organization, and they're given the opportunity to self-identify at the end of the survey, and that includes whether they're LGBTQ+. And we're seeing a growing trend of people self-identifying. Now, obviously, we don't track that back to the individual. That's an anonymous survey that they do, but it gives us a piece of data to understand, are people more comfortable sharing that data? We've done self-identification at the board level. When we published our EEO one data here in the United States, that included self-identification at the board level. So we're encouraging it, but we're also being very cautious about privacy. You don't want a misstep from a privacy standpoint. There are still risks out there in the environment. There are places where people can put themselves at risk of being discriminated against, and we don't want to encourage that. And there are countries where it can be worse than just discrimination. So we have to walk very carefully. But I do think the ERG team that leads this is moving to try to add some additional measurements into the system and keep building on what we have.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And actually, Beth obviously mentioned about self-identification at the beginning. The challenge with LGBTQ is that it's invisible. We need people to come out to be open and visible to our community. Whereas if you compare it with gender and race, you can normally see someone's racial diversity, like mine, for instance, or if you're a woman. So I'd love to get your perspective as well. Dame Inga, or Inga, what do you prefer, Inga?
Inga's fine. And I'm going to actually go back to my time when I was at Lloyd's. I started there in 2014. And nobody, even though every year on the employee survey we asked them to self-identify themselves, we had less than 10% of the employees filling in that field. And so we didn't really know if the LGBT community were engaged or whether they were particularly upset about a certain aspect. And so I started talking about it openly as the CEO, and I managed to get, before too long, over 90% of the employees completed that field. And then people saw how we were using the data. They saw that we were actually using it to check in that they were okay, that they weren't feeling discriminated against or anything like that. And so the more you had the data and showed why you were using it, the more people gave you the data. So it became very self-fulfilling. And there was one regret that I have from when I was as the CEO of Lloyd's, because actually we did have a couple of people from the LGBT+ community on our group executive, and we didn't identify them sort of on the website or publicly. And I wish we'd had a sort of, maybe just a little pride flag or something. We could have done that, because we were very proud about the gender balance we'd achieved, the racial balance, but somehow we missed that. And if I could go back in time, that's what I would do.
Well, it also sounds like a huge research project, because it's not been done before, to measure LGBTQ diversity in the boardroom and C-suite from Bloomberg, hopefully. So we put it forward. Let's see if they actually turn it around. I'm really keen to move on to the next question, which is, where do you see LGBT+ hiring sitting relatively to women and race? Given Stop Asian Hate, Black Lives Matters, Me Too, how has the LGBT+ agenda become less important to C-suite and boardrooms? Inga, let's come back to you for this one first.
Do you know, I don't think it ever really was on there. I mean, in all the time that I've been hiring, we have seldom gone back to the search firm and said, oh, come on, we want somebody from the LGBT+ community. And so I don't think it sort of got on there in any big way to then be taken off or removed from the priority list. For sure, gender's been up there for ages. Now we've got the, people are very concerned about people's ethnic backgrounds, and so they're focusing on that. I would love it if the LGBT aspect was also there. I just don't think it ever was, to any meaningful extent, to have now been displaced or put as a lower priority for one of the other aspects. We need to focus on it all.
Agreed. Beth, what are your thoughts?
Well, I want a diverse slate of candidates for all positions in all aspects of diversity. I'm not sure, back to Inga's point, that we've ever called that out specifically. So it's not a matter of pulling back from it. Frankly, the challenge right now for talent is considerable, and we're looking for best candidates. Diversity is a key priority. So one of the things we do prioritize is making sure we have a diverse slate. To your point, is it an opportunity for us to add LGBTQ? Now, the implication, again, is self-identification for a candidate, and that there are firms who concentrate and focus on that you're partnering with as you identify candidates. I'm not sure that's widespread. So it is another area of diversity. We do ask for diverse slates. It's not an either or, it's a broad swath of diversity that as we focus on talent. But I'm not sure that we've identified specifically that as an element. And again, it's because I'm not sure there are a lot of firms that focus on that in and of itself.
Yeah, it's interesting, because obviously I run an executive search firm called Audeliss. And I have to say, since the BLM protests, both sides of the pond, we've never seen such a laser focus on race, and specifically the Black community, which is much needed because it's woeful representation both sides of the pond. But in my 18 years in doing executive search, I've never been asked by a chairman or CEO to focus on LGBT+. If anything, gender has always been the priority. So if, for instance, let's say you're all CEOs in your day jobs, or a chair in Inga's day job, if, for instance, you've got that gender representation and you've got that race representation, how do we bring LGBTQ into the agenda to bolster that representation? Jim, any perspectives from you?
I think you have to, all hiring has become much more intentional right now. And if I look at the participation we have in employee resource groups at Dow, it's grown in the last 3 years from 15% to now more than 50% of our employee population is part of an ERG. And we use the ERGs to be more intentional about hiring. Right now, I would say in the case of LGBTQ+, it's just making people aware that we are open for business and that we are hiring and what our track record is in terms of support for LGBTQ+ people and trying to bring it up to the level. I would say tracking, I agree with Beth and Inga. I don't know that it was ever on the tracking metrics, but we are mandating now diverse hiring slates, hiring managers on slates and diverse candidate pools. And we're seeing a big difference in gender hiring, gender advancement, racial hiring and racial advancement. And that's positive. So I think if we're intentional about going out there and making it public, that we are open for business, that word gets out. And I'm starting to see that pick up. So I think you will probably see some increased inbound inquiries. Every time I go to a college campus to talk to students, they're interested. They're interested to understand, what role they have or what place they might have in a career at Dow.
Absolutely. I mean, we always talk about diversity hiring, meaning that you're widening the gate, not lowering the bar, because there is this big misconception that when you're doing diversity hiring, it means you're compromising on quality, which is not true. So I'd be really.
Do you mind if I add a comment there?
Of course. Yeah. Go back.
I think the diversity in the hiring, to Jim's point, to Inga's point, it's been laser focused, and we want a broad candidate pool. Actually, the bigger challenge is the inclusion piece. It's the retention piece. Because again, we can bring candidates in, a diversity of all kinds, but they have to feel included and connected to the mission of the company, to the teams more broadly. And some of that is policy, but some of that is culture and the way that they're feeling connected. So, we oftentimes focus on, are you bringing them in? And that's important. You've got to have a pool of best talent. But we've been more intentional of late of focusing on the inclusion piece of this, their connectedness to the mission of the company and other employees. And that's a challenge because sometimes you don't see it. We hire the full person. They have a number of issues in their family, in their life, whatever. And it's not a policy in a company that's going to connect them to the company. It's the culture and it's the way the company is invested in their community and in their families.
I completely agree with Beth. That's exactly the thing that we're focused on. Is if the culture is accepting and uplifting and positive and focused on positive outcomes, it's good for everyone. It's good for our customers. It's good for our shareholders. It's good for our employees, for their development, for their advancement. And we have more candid conversations and more challenging conversations in that environment than we ever did in the previous environments. I think culture's everything in this.
Absolutely. And Beth, you touched on it earlier about the challenges of finding talent. So we know that there's a war for diverse talent. We know, so if you're going to win that war, like you say, you absolutely have to focus on also retaining the talent that you're finding and bringing into your business. We actually have a question from the audience here, which I'm going to ask now. How do we, Inga, this is for you. Let's start with you on this one. How do we move to a more unbiased and accepting office culture and not judge by one's appearance or stereotypical gender expectations?
Well, that could be a whole week's conversation in itself, because it's a huge thing. I mean, it is absolutely huge. And of course, it's what organizations have been trying to get to in their culture change. And culture is so important in a company and yet so undefinable. Yes, and yet immediately you're in one company culture that it feels very different to another one. You can't really define it. But I mean, people have been striving for this for so long. Now, when I was at Lloyd's, I did not if I'm absolutely honest, I didn't approach this whole thing in a very scientific way. I didn't go in thinking I've got to solve this. I just knew that something wasn't right and that we weren't modernizing and able to modernize and move forward if we didn't do something about this culture and attract these different people and stop people making judgments when they shouldn't have. And so we kind of did all sorts of things. I mean, I can't, there's probably nothing we didn't try. Yeah, we tried everything from all different angles. One for me, though, one of the most important things was we started with the data, but it was as soon as we got to emotional stories and you managed to get a hook into someone, that then changed the conversation and the understanding. And with some people, that took a long time. So some people were really cynical, and I didn't give up. I just kept going. And it might have taken 18 months, 2 years for me to find the one emotional hook that they said, wow, now I get it. And now I realize that I shouldn't be so judgmental, or I should hire a diverse team or something. But the data is one thing, and policies need to be changed and all of that. But it's got to be around emotions. It's got to be around people telling stories, having conversations, and sometimes difficult conversations. Often we're fearing anything, getting people with different views together. But we have to allow people with different views to have a conversation, or we won't uncover what the difficulties are in an organisation. So that was what I found, one of the key learnings: get the conversation started.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask about what responsibility do you think organisations have to speak out externally on LGBT+ rights as part of showing their support to LGBT+ employees? Jim, would you like to take that first?
Well, we've a track record of doing that, and led by the employees inside the organization. And I think the way I look at this is we're trying to fight for our employees' equality and their equal rights. It isn't like we're fighting for something special for them. We're fighting for them to be treated equally and not discriminated against. And so when we see actions that we think are discriminatory, or that move to take something away from them, or act like they are not granted the same human rights as everyone else, within the organization, we reach up and we respond. We've done it in Texas, Louisiana, Indiana, all over the world, to stand up for rights. And we have people that actually work on things like the amicus brief for marriage equality, health benefits, tax benefits, the same kind of rights that married partners would have, that you would have in a domestic partnership. And so it's from an equality standpoint that we look at it. And we encourage people to bring those conversations, and then we support them when we need to get out there and visibly show support. And we're not alone. There are many companies that join us and have always joined us in doing that.
Yeah. Beth, any thoughts from you?
This is one of those questions that goes to what is the role of the CEO now, right? Much broader. Yeah. And this question and a lot of questions. How should I weigh in? How does Jim weigh in? How does Inga weigh in? When she's CEO or chair? And I'm a big believer that I weigh in, and we weigh in representing the organization when we can move the ball forward, I mean, not everybody wants to hear my point of view or the company's point of view on every issue, right? I mean, that's just not helpful, because it's more folks just, adding to the conversation. But when we know that there's an implication, as Jim notes, to our employees, or when we're trying to move the ball forward in the conversation, and we believe that view is of value, then we weigh in. Then we say, this is important. This is the way we're perceiving this, and why we have a concern. So, I don't want to be too cute and say we want to try to be selective, but weighing in on every issue is challenging, right? Because that's not the role of the corporation, in my view, or the CEO, and rather it is when something is important, and we can, our voice would be helpful in moving forward towards a solution.
But I do think it's a lot harder now. I was just going to say it's a lot harder for the CEO or the chair to sit on the fence on certain issues, particularly when it comes to LGBTQ+ issues that can be quite divisive when you think about your customers or client base that you might have, say, in the Middle East or Russia, or in regions where it's much more challenging to be LGBT. Inga?
Sorry, I was just going to say this similar thing to you, actually, that it's almost you don't have an opportunity now to be quiet on topics. There's an expectation from, a lot of employees now are absolutely expecting the leaders to have an opinion on things. And CEOs didn't used to have to opine on any of this. It's almost now expected. It's changed. And I always remember, how good it felt. Years and years ago, back in the 80s, I was in a frontline role meeting clients from around the world. And one day a client came in to see me. He was from a country in Africa where he really refused to see or deal with a woman in business terms. He didn't know that my name was a female name. So he arrived in the office. He refused to see me. Absolutely refused to see me. My manager stuck by me and said, "I'm sorry, if you don't see Inga, you're not going to see anyone here." He did actually leave, and we lost some business. But that's the sort of support that you can do, maybe not broadcast support, but when you do little things like that as well, they're enormously powerful and helpful for individuals.
Absolutely. We've got another question from the audience here. Jim, I'm going to come to you with this one. You've spoken about the struggles in hiring at the moment. What are you doing to ensure that diverse hiring doesn't fall down the priority list? Might current conditions set things back, particularly in terms of the talent pipeline? Jim, what do you think?
I actually think it's the opposite. I think you talked earlier about trying to widen the gate or open the aperture, what I say all the time. You're in a war for talent right now, so it's actually the opposite. It works to your advantage if you get out there and widen the gate. I've noticed, like within our team right now, the use of social media to get the word out to the public about job openings that are out there for now, which historically would not have been a big avenue for us to try to generate interest. Getting our employees involved in the hiring process. When we go out, for example, if we go out to an ACU gathering, we send the hiring team armed to be able to make offers on the spot. We've had discussions internally about what to do before we get out there. When we go out to other events, and we use things like Society of Women Engineers, Hispanic Latin Network, other network, Out and Equal, Out Leadership, other networks that we belong to, we get out there and we advertise that we're open for business. I think this is a great opportunity for us moving forward. And then we showcase stories. Inga mentioned earlier about stories. You have to showcase stories about how people are supported and the opportunities they get inside. And there's no better way to do that than your own employees out there on the front line saying, here's why I like working at Dow or whatever company that I'm with, because this is how I'm treated at work, and I'm not treated any differently than anyone else. I think that's powerful.
No, fantastic. I want to move on to, a lot of companies are putting chief diversity officers onto the management board. Do you think this should be more widespread? And having a chief diversity officer on the board or management board, do you think they're able to implement real change? Beth, let's come to you first.
Well, on our management board, of course, is my chief human resource officer and chief diversity officer as part of that group. I understand the reason and the question and the visibility. The challenge for that, to me, almost goes back to my operating days, where you say, well, if you've got the safety guy is responsible for safety, right? And in reality, what I would like is for everybody to see themselves as the chief diversity officer on the team. So I think if you're most powerful within your management team, everybody is committed and from a values perspective is focused on that and can speak to that. And in fact, all of my team in the C-suite is tied to one of our ERGs. They are the key sponsor. And then we as a management team have our diversity and inclusion meetings, with the folks that are heading the ERGs. So I understand the question and the why, is somebody keeping something top of mind? I would wish that everybody saw it as their role. I would wish that everybody has a voice with different ERGs and bringing that to the conversation at the management level, and that everybody increases their visibility in ERG leadership.
Absolutely. Inga, any perspectives on the chief diversity officer role and their and their purpose?
Well, sometimes, when you're a CEO, you want kind of all of the key important things represented on your group, but you also know in practical terms it doesn't work to have everybody there. And I absolutely with Beth on this. It is everyone's role in an organisation. I did appoint a diversity officer, and that became the sort of centre of expertise. So the responsibility was for everybody and all the senior leaders, but you knew you had somebody who was keeping us on our toes, providing all the latest knowledge, providing all the latest developments, egging us on, and became very much a centre of expertise and somebody that the management would draw on. And that's how we tended to use that role. And of course, they had specific goals, but I also had specific goals for my management team. So they had to improve gender diversity and things like that, and they had goals. So it was spread out across everyone.
Great. I think that from my perspective, with the CDO, I think the key thing is what support structures do they have? And I completely agree with you, Beth. It's everyone's responsibility to drive diversity and inclusion, not just one person in an organisation. It's impossible otherwise. We've only got 4 minutes left. So I wanted to ask you one final question each to perhaps share your advice or intervention or something that's going to really help the audience that are watching today to really drive LGBTQ diversity management. Is there one thing that you can point to or advice that you might want to give to our LGBT viewers that might be out there about how they can climb to the C-suite and boardroom too? So let's start with you first, Jim.
Well, I think one of the things that is most important is to get the experiences that you need inside the organization. Advancement is key. And I think from our perspective, you have to measure to be able to know if people are advancing and getting the right opportunities. Metrics drive everything that we do, whether it's inclusion, whether it's participation in ERGs, metrics drive it, supplier diversity programs, where we're hiring. We have metrics behind all of that, and we're trying to drive outcomes. Yet we're trying to build a culture that accepts all that, but we're interested in results too, and you have to have both. You have to have both working together. And so I think that is the biggest. When people look at what it takes to run a company like ours, you need a lot of experience, but part of that experience is also dealing with people. Your biggest job every day is to influence, however many thousand employees that you have working for you. And that is what you have to do day in and day out.
Absolutely. Inga, what would your advice be?
It's no different to the LGBT community as to any other at work. And I learned this and was taught it years ago. And it's the PIE model. PIE, performance, image, and exposure. They're the three things you have to focus on. Now, sometimes we only think it's about performance when we start off in our career, and that was what I thought. All I need to do is do a good job, and I'll get noticed, recognized, and promoted. You have to work on the I, which is your image. You have to know how you're coming across, and then work on the E, the exposure. Strategically work on maximum exposure throughout your career. Those three together, you can get there.
Well, I'm definitely stealing that for my next speaking engagement, the PIE model. Beth, last but by no means least, what would your advice or intervention be to support diversity in LGBTQ management?
I think the advice I always give to people is, you do your best work when you are your authentic self. And when organizations allow someone to come in, show up as their authentic self and are supported, it's amazing what the team together can do and how you can feel not just connected, but how you do and deliver your best work. So always in these questions, I say, please you're great the way you are. You don't have to change for somebody else, but you need to be your best self. You need to show up as your best self, your best partner. And by the way, to be a great leader and move people along, it's really little about you. It's about enabling somebody else's success. And so I think if organizations and if you say, how can I move it forward? I think that's what I encourage. Remember, leadership is not about you. It's about everybody else and enabling their success, and show up as your authentic self and give everybody the room to show up as their authentic self. And it's amazing what you can do as an organization.